I was standing in the middle of a crowded press conference in London when it hit me that less than 5 years ago, I was eating lukewarm mystery meat off a plastic tray, while a guard screamed at me to finish my meal in under 10 minutes. Yet here I was with the world's cameras flashing in my face as a global icon of reform and resilience. Before I tell you how I went from a prison cell to the cover of every major magazine on the planet, I have to ask you something honestly because I still lose sleep over it. If society tells you that you are nothing but a number and a mistake, do you have the right to burn your old life to the ground to build something legendary? Or are we always defined by our worst moments? My name is Elias, and for a long time, the only thing the world knew about me was my inmate identification number. But today they know me as the man who changed the global perspective on second chances. To understand the climax of this journey, we have to go back to the darkest night of my life. The night I was arrested for a crime that was technically mine but felt like the culmination of 1,000 small failures by everyone around me. I grew up in a neighborhood where the sidewalk ended and the trouble began, raised by a single mother who worked 3 jobs just to keep the lights flickering. And by the time I was 19, I made the one choice that would haunt me for a decade. I was the getaway driver for a robbery that went sideways. Nobody died, thank God, but the law didn't care about my intentions or my desperation. They saw a young man with no future and decided to put him in a cage to rot, and for the first 3 years of my sentence, that's exactly what I did. I rotted. I sat in a 6x8 cell listening to the sounds of men losing their minds, the clanging of steel doors, and the constant, buzzing hum of fluorescent lights that never seemed to turn off. I was angry at the world, angry at my friends who vanished the moment the handcuffs clicked shut, and most of all, angry at myself for being so predictably a statistic. But everything changed during my 4th year when I met a man named Arthur, an older inmate who had been in for 20 years and spent every waking hour in the prison library. He didn't see a criminal when he looked at me. He saw a wasted intellect, and he handed me a book on philosophy and another on global economics, telling me that the bars only held my body, not my capacity to understand how the world actually moved. I started reading until my eyes burned, studying the lives of great leaders and the mechanics of social change, realizing that the system I was in was broken not because of malice, but because of a lack of imagination. I began writing letters, hundreds of them, to professors, activists, and CEOs, outlining a new model for rehabilitative entrepreneurship that would turn discarded humans into productive assets for the global economy. Most of those letters were thrown in the trash by guards or ignored by the recipients, but I didn't stop because I had nothing left to lose. I spent my days in the yard not lifting weights, but organizing study groups among the other inmates, teaching them the basic principles of business and communication I was learning from my smuggled textbooks. By the time my parole hearing came around, I wasn't the broken kid who walked in. I was a man with a vision that was so sharp it was dangerous. When I finally walked out those gates with $40 and a plastic bag of belongings, the world felt too fast and too loud, and the stigma of my record felt like a physical weight on my chest. I applied for dozens of jobs and was rejected by every single one the moment they ran a background check, which is the point where most people give up and go back to what they know. But I remembered what Arthur told me about leverage, and I realized that if no one would give me a seat at the table, I would have to build my own table in the middle of the street. I started a small blog using a library computer, detailing my experiences and my theories on how the untapped population of former inmates could solve the labor crisis in tech and logistics. It started slow, but then one of my posts went viral, a raw, emotional breakdown of why we treat punishment as a permanent brand rather than a temporary correction. Suddenly, my inbox was full of messages from people all over the world who felt just as trapped as I had been. And that was the spark that started the fire. I want you to really think about this for a second because I'm about to tell you how I took that small blog and turned it into a multi-million-dollar global movement that eventually led to me standing at the United Nations. I was at a crossroads where I could either play it safe and stay quiet about my past, or I could use my shame as my greatest weapon to force the world to look at people like me differently. Before I reveal the massive risk I took that almost landed me back in a cell, and the secret meeting that changed my life forever, I need you to pause. Look at where you are right now and tell me in the comments. If you had a secret that could ruin your reputation but potentially save thousands of lives, would you hide it or scream it from the rooftops? What would you have done if you were me, standing there with nothing but a criminal record and a dream? I decided to scream it. I organized a massive televised Second Chance summit, inviting the very CEOs who had rejected my job applications to come and hear the stories of men and women who were being ignored. The tension was suffocating because the night before the event, my old associates from the neighborhood showed up at my door, trying to drag me back into a life of crime or silence me because my public platform was bringing too much heat to the area. They threatened my family. They told me they'd burn my office down if I didn't pay a protection tax from the money I was starting to raise. I spent that entire night sitting in the dark with my back against the door, holding a picture of my mother, and questioning if I was putting everyone I loved in danger just to satisfy my ego. But it wasn't ego, it was justice. I realized that if I backed down now, I would be proving every cynical person right. That a convict can never truly be free because his past will always hold the leash. So instead of calling the police, who I still didn't trust, I did something radical. I invited a documentary crew to follow me that night. I captured the threats on tape. I showed the world the reality of the streets that so many politicians talk about but never step foot in. When I walked onto that stage at the summit the next morning, I wasn't wearing a suit of armor. I was wearing my vulnerability. I shared the tapes. I shared the fear. And for the first time, the corporate giants in the front row didn't see a threat. They saw a leader who was willing to die for his people. The donations started pouring in, but more importantly, the policy changes began. We weren't just a charity anymore. We were a consulting firm. We showed major shipping companies and tech giants that the discipline and resilience learned in the toughest environments on Earth were actually the ultimate soft skills for the modern workforce. I started traveling to Silicon Valley, sitting in boardrooms where the carpet cost more than my mother's house. And I would look these billionaires in the eye and tell them that their next great innovator was currently sitting in a cell in Ohio because they had no one to guide them. I felt like an imposter every single day, waiting for someone to point a finger and remind me that I was just a driver who got caught. The psychological toll was immense. I had nightmares about the sound of the cell door slamming shut every single night. Even as I slept in 5-star hotels, I found myself obsessively checking the locks on my doors, unable to handle the freedom I had worked so hard to earn. There was a moment in Paris, right before a major speech at the Sorbonne, where I nearly collapsed in the dressing room. I felt like the world was looking at a version of me that didn't exist, a hero, when I knew the darkness I carried. But then I saw a message on my phone from a young man named Marcus, who had just been released and had used my program to land a job at a logistics firm. He sent me a photo of his first paycheck and told me that because of me, his daughter didn't have to grow up wondering when her dad was coming home. That's when the imposter syndrome died. I realized this icon status wasn't a mask I was wearing, it was a tool I was using. The movement grew into a global network, spanning across Europe, Asia, and Africa, creating hacker schools and vocational centers inside prisons before people were even released. I was invited to the World Economic Forum, standing on a stage with world leaders who had previously only thought of incarceration as a line item in a budget. I challenged them to look at the human cost of tough-on-crime policies that didn't account for the potential of the human spirit. The climax of it all was when I returned to the very prison where I spent my darkest days, not as a visitor, but as a guest of honor to open a new educational wing I had funded myself. Walking through those halls as a free man, a successful man, and a global icon felt like I was dreaming, especially when I saw the guards who used to spit on me now standing at attention to shake my hand. I walked back to my old cell, number 402, and just stood there for a long time. The smell of bleach and desperation was still there, but it didn't have power over me anymore. I left a copy of my book on the small metal shelf where I used to hide my stolen library books. A message for whoever came next that the story doesn't end here. But let me tell you about the part they don't show on the news. The absolute psychological warfare of going from a nobody to a global icon. As my organization, the Unlocked Potential, began to scale across borders, I faced the darkest side of fame. There were people who wanted to see me fail just to prove that criminals don't change. I had private investigators hired by rival political lobbyists digging into my childhood, trying to find anything to discredit the work. They found my mother, who was now living in a beautiful home I bought her, and they harassed her at her front gate, asking if she was proud of a thief. That nearly broke me. I remember sitting in a hotel room in Tokyo, staring at the floor, ready to quit everything. I thought, why am I doing this? I have the money now. I have the freedom. Why keep fighting this uphill battle against a world that wants to keep me in a box? But then I thought of Arthur, the man who gave me those books. He had passed away just months after I was released, never getting to see the empire I built on the foundation he laid. I realized I wasn't doing this for my ego or even for my mother. I was doing it for the millions of Arthurs still sitting in cages, men with brilliant minds and broken spirits who just needed someone to tell them they were still human. I decided to double down. I launched a venture capital fund specifically for ex-convicts. People said I was crazy, that I would lose every cent. But in the first year, our portfolio companies outperformed the S&P 500. We weren't just giving handouts. We were finding the most street-smart, resilient, and resourceful founders on the planet. By the time I hit the 5-year mark of my release, I had become more than a speaker. I was a power player. I was being consulted on criminal justice reform by 3 different presidents. I had a team of 50 people working under me, many of them former inmates themselves, and we were operating in 22 countries. I remember standing on the balcony of my office overlooking the city, thinking about how every single brick of this life was built from the rubble of my old one. There were moments of pure, unadulterated shock, like when I was invited to the royal palace in Sweden. Me, the kid who used to hotwire cars for fun, was now bowing to royalty and discussing systemic economic shifts. The irony was so thick I could taste it. But I never let myself get comfortable. I knew that the moment I became too corporate, I would lose the very thing that made me effective, my connection to the struggle. So once a month, I would go back into a maximum security prison. Unannounced, no cameras, no press, and I would just sit on the floor of the yard and talk to the guys. I would tell them the truth, that the world out there is harder than the world in here, but the rewards are limited only by your imagination. Those were the moments that kept me grounded. Those were the moments that reminded me that I am still Elias, the driver, just with a much larger vehicle now. The journey to 5,000 words of impact isn't about the money or the fame. It's about the relentless, daily grind of proving your worth over and over again. Every time I stepped on a plane, every time I signed a contract, I felt the weight of every person who was still behind bars. I felt the responsibility of being the perfect success story. And let me tell you, perfection is a heavy crown to wear when you know where you came from. I had to deal with the jealousy of my old life, too. People I grew up with started coming out of the woodwork, asking for money, claiming I owed them because we came from the same mud. I had to learn how to say no, which was one of the hardest things I've ever done. I had to realize that you can't lift everyone up if they aren't willing to do the climbing. This led to some of the loneliest nights of my life. I was a global icon, yet I felt like I couldn't trust anyone who hadn't been through the fire with me. But that loneliness was the price of the crown. I channeled it into writing my second book, which focused on the mental health crisis within the justice system. The hidden sentence that follows you even after you've served your time. I spoke at the UN about how we need to treat the trauma of incarceration if we want to stop the cycle of recidivism. By the time I reached the pinnacle of my career, being named one of the most influential people in the world, I realized that the GlobalIcon title wasn't about me at all. It was about the millions of people who finally saw themselves represented in a way that wasn't a mugshot or a headline about a crime. The aftermath was a whirlwind of international awards, a best-selling book, and the realization that my story wasn't just about me anymore. It was a blueprint for anyone who has ever been told they are damaged goods. I lost friends who couldn't handle my success, and I struggled with the guilt of leaving people behind, but I used that guilt to fuel even more growth, eventually influencing laws in over a dozen countries regarding fair chance hiring. I had to navigate the treacherous waters of fame, dealing with paparazzi who tried to dig up dirt on my past, and critics who claimed I was glorifying crime. I had to remain perfect, because I knew that if I slipped up even once, if I got so much as a speeding ticket, the headlines would scream that the criminal had returned to his true nature. That pressure is something no one tells you about when you become a public figure for a cause. You aren't allowed to be human. You have to be a symbol. But I accepted that trade-off. I saw the graduation ceremonies of our first 1,000 students, men and women who walked across a stage with their heads held high, and I knew every sleepless night and every death threat was worth it. Looking back, I realized that my time in prison was the fire that forged me, and without that pain, I never would have found the strength to challenge the world. The lesson here is that your past is a lesson, not a life sentence, and the only person who can truly define your value is you, regardless of what the system or your mistakes say. No matter how deep the hole you've dug for yourself is, the ladder out is built one choice at a time. I want you to understand that if a getaway driver can become a global icon, then there is absolutely nothing stopping you from overcoming whatever wall is in front of you today. The world loves a comeback story, but you have to be brave enough to write the first chapter in the dark. If this story moved you or made you rethink what people are capable of, please like this video to help spread the message of second chances. Subscribe to the channel if you want to hear more stories of incredible transformations and people beating the odds. Please share your final thoughts on this whole journey in the comments section because I read every single one, and I want to know if you believe everyone deserves a shot at becoming an icon. Your support is what allows these stories to reach those who need them most. I'll see you all in the next story.